Good morning, sunshines. All right, so today we're going to talk about walls. Yay! In theater, walls are referred to as flats. And as opposed to real walls in real world, they are made out of materials which resemble walls, but are lightweight and inexpensive. There are two basic types of flats. There's what's called a Broadway flat, which is made out of wood and muslin, soft cover flat, some people call it, and a Hollywood flat, which is made out of wood. Or people often, sometimes will cover masonite and that sort of stuff. But they have two sort of distinct ways of construction, but the basic elements are all the same. But before we get into the elements, we're gonna watch this little video.
So as we talked about in the last lesson, there are two types of flats that we use on the stage. One is a Hollywood flat, and the other is a Broadway flat. Hollywood flats are designed primarily for movies, television, and things like that. Hollywood flats are sturdier, they're stronger, they are covered with wood, and so they're made to last a long time. They're made to be out in the weather and things like that. A Broadway flat, however, is not made out of wood. It does have a wood frame, but it is covered with fabric. The fabric is called muslin, and it's a lot like a lightweight canvas. We cover the Broadway flats with muslin because, one, that makes them lightweight, and therefore it's easy to move on stage. For instance, if we are doing a musical and we have multiple sets on the stage, we need to be able to have people pick them up and move them off very easily. So in order to do that, we make it as lightweight as possible. The other reason that we want to cover a flat with muslin is that it's cheap, it's inexpensive. In the theater, a lot of times, you're only going to run a show for a week or 2 weeks or maybe a month, but you're not going to run the show for a long period of time. So since you're not running it for a long period of time and you know you're going to take everything apart at the end, you don't want to spend the money that you would spend to build a real wall in your house and make everything perfect and heavy duty, because you're going to take it right back apart. Another thing is, most theaters don't have a lot of extra money to spend. You want to build things to be as cheap as possible, as lightweight as possible, and as easy to work with as possible. With Broadway flats, we have 7 major parts, okay? There are screws and glue and things like that, but we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about the 7 parts that you would have to cut, either with the saw or scissors or something like that, for a Broadway flat if you were going to build one, okay? So we have what we call rails, stiles, toggles, keystones, corner blocks, corner braces, and the muslin that we already talked about. Okay, so what does that look like? Rails are pieces of 1x3. They're white pine usually, but it can be other types of wood, but they're 1x3 pieces of lumber. They go across the top and the bottom of the flat to make the frame. Okay, we call it a rail because the flat is going to slide along that just like a train glides along a rail when we're trying to move it. If one person, who's maybe a smaller person, is trying to pick up a wall and move it on the stage, they might have a hard time and they might drop that wall. But if a flat is built correctly, then one person can take that wall and slide it on the stage, and because the rail goes the entire width of the flat, there are no corners or edges to catch on. Okay, so when they slide that across the stage, there's not going to be anything to catch, and it's going to slide easily without breaking apart. Now, stiles are kind of like rails, except for stiles don't go across the top and the bottom of the flat. They make the sides of the frame. So let's imagine that we have a 4-foot wide by 8-foot tall flat. I'm going to put 2 rails, one at the top and one at the bottom, and they're going to be 4 feet wide. But I need 2 stiles to help make the rectangular frame. The stiles are going to be placed inside of the 2 rails. So I have my 8 feet wide, and I'm going to take out the width of the 2 rails to figure out how long the stiles should be. Okay, so an 8-foot tall flat. I've got 1x3 white pine for the top and the bottom. So let's say that the top is 3 inches wide and the bottom is 3 inches wide. We'll go into why that's not quite true later, but 3 inches and 3 inches. So that's 6 inches we're taking out, okay? So my stiles would be 7 feet, 6 inches long. So I have 2 rails that are 4 feet long, 2 stiles that are 7 foot 6 inches, okay? Now we need toggles. Okay, what a toggle is it looks just like a rail or stile, but it's going to be a support in the middle of the frame of the flat. Okay, sometimes we'll have 1 toggle, sometimes we'll have 2 toggles, sometimes we'll have more. Depends on the height of the flat. So on our example, we have an 8-foot tall flat. If it's a Broadway flat, then it's got a soft cover, so it's not going to be very firm on the, or very structured on the outside. So we need to add these toggles to help add structure to it. So we're going to add a toggle about every 2.5 feet. So at 2.5 feet from the bottom, we're going to have a toggle. Okay, 2.5 feet up from that is 5.5 feet, or 5 feet, there's going to be a toggle. Okay, 2.5 feet up from that would be 7.5 feet. So realistically, we don't want to have a toggle 6 inches away from the end or 3 inches away from the end or something like that. So we're going to put 2 toggles in an 8-foot flat, and we're going to spread them out a little bit to where it's maybe 2 foot 8, 2 foot 7, somewhere around there in between them, and that will make us a nice strong 8-foot flat. Okay, so we've done the rails, the stiles, the toggles. The next thing that we need is corner braces. Okay, a corner brace is going to go, there's going to be 2 of them on your flat. So 2 rails, 2 stiles, 2 toggles in this one, and now 2 corner braces. The corner braces are both going to go on the same side. So they're either both going to go on the left side of the flat or both on the right side of the flat. And they're going to be at a 45-degree angle. And they're going to go, one's going to go from the top of the flat, from the top rail, down to, let's say, the right side stile, and the other one's going to go from the bottom rail to the right side stile. Okay, so how are we going to attach those? We can't screw into the wood without splitting it, because these are going to sit end to end, or the narrow side to narrow side, so we don't want to split the wood. So we're going to take what we call a keystone, and we're going to put a keystone over the 2 pieces of wood and screw it together, just like in this diagram. Okay, so the keystones hold the pieces together. They hold the toggles to the stiles, and they hold the corner braces to the stiles. Okay, now what about the rails to the stiles? We haven't talked about that. Okay, the rails are going to be held to the stiles with a triangular piece of wood that's called a corner block. Okay, keystones and corner blocks are both made out of 1/4-inch plywood, and that's what's going to attach it all together. So keystones and corner blocks hold the rails, stiles, toggles, corner braces together. Then when we've got the frame completely built, we're going to cover it with muslin. Okay, we're not going to pull it too tight. We're going to just cover it, staple it down, glue the edges. Okay, when we paint the muslin, it's going to shrink up a little bit. If we pull it too tight when we cover it originally, the paint will shrink up and it will tear the muslin. So we want to leave a little bit of sag in there in that muslin. Next, we'll talk about Hollywood flats.
Okay, so now that you know all this stuff, I'm just going to sort of repeat what he just went over in the video. But the basic elements of the Hollywood flat and the Broadway flat as well. The top and the bottom of the flat are called the rails. Again, they're continuous all the way across, so that in case you're moving across the floor, you don't have any kind of bump to the seam or something like that. But the top and the bottom of the flat are called the rails. The sides of the flats are called the stiles, S-T-I-L-E-S. Any kind of internal support that goes all the way across from side to side is called a toggle. And any kind of diagonal brace or diagonal support is always going to be on the same side. The diagonals really are to keep the flat square. You're really going to rarely see a diagonal brace on a Hollywood flat because the material that is the outside of the flat is also wood is going to keep the flat square itself. But oftentimes, especially if you have a very tall Hollywood flat, 16 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet flat, it is often nice to have that additional diagonal brace to keep it from warping or from getting out of square, yes. And so those diagonal braces, again, over an 8-foot span, you're probably not going to need a diagonal brace, even though they did in the video put one in or put two in. But usually, again, you're only going to need those over very large expanses. And again, the main purpose of those diagonals is to keep the flat square. Now, toggles want to be at least every 4 feet. Again, in the video, they put them every 2'6". It sort of depends on what you might need as far as support. 4 foot will generally do fine on most walls. Again, if you have, we're going to talk more about doors and windows later in the lecture today. If you have any kind of framing like that, you may actually have to have additional support of toggles, that sort of thing, to keep things in line. Again, in order to put these pieces together in a Broadway flat, at the 4 corners, you're going to have these pieces of luan, usually, or 1/4 inch plywood, that are called corner blocks. They're triangular shaped. The grain always wants to go in a direction across the seam. So when you're laying the corner block over to attach it to the Broadway flat, the seam of one board where it comes down to where the stile comes down to the rail, you got this seam right here, and the grain of the corner block wants to go over the seam because the grain is the strongest way and will resist breaking as more than if you put it the other way around. So there's a right way and a wrong way to put the corner blocks on. Then additionally, for any kind of toggle or diagonal braces, you'll have these things called keystones. People will also use things called straps. A strap is the same thing as a keystone, only it's a rectangle. A keystone, technically, just like the keystone in an arch, is wider at one end than it is in the other. And so for holding things like toggles on, the wide part goes onto the stile and the thinner part will go onto the toggle, yes? Now, there's a definite pattern for nailing these or stapling these corner blocks and keystones on. Cody's going to show it to you. I call them, if you look at the one, let's talk about the one about the cornerstone first. First of all, you put a staple or a nail in each of the 3 corners. That's easy. Then you're going to put 4 staples right around the seam, right across the seam. And then you're going to create a W, or in this case an M because it's upside down, but you're going to create an M on one side and then a V on the other side, or an M on the other side, whichever way you want to look at it. But that is the correct pattern. You'll get the most bang out of your buck for your staples and you use the fewest numbers of staples. Now, anytime you're adding a cornerstone or a corner block or keystone, you want to keep the edge back about 3/4 of an inch because the 3/4 of an inch is the thickness of the board, the 1x4 that the flat is made out of. And that way, if you ever have a corner where 2 flats come together, they will have a place where you can put them together. You don't have the bump that's created by the cornerstone or the keystones. There's the space called the keep back is what it's called, about 3/4 of an inch from the edge or more. And I would also always glue your cornerstones and your corner blocks and your keystones. Again, ultimately the glue will actually be stronger in holding the pieces together than the staples will. But I would always, unless you know that you're going to take this apart in the near future, and even if you know you're going to destroy it totally, but if you're going to adapt it, you might not. But you don't really adapt soft covered flats. Then the pattern for the keystone is you staple the 4 corners, you put the 4 staples right around the seam, and you put 1 staple right in the middle, making a double 5 pattern if you ever played dominoes, yes? But again, that's with the cornerstone, with the corner block and the keystone, both of them want to make sure the grain goes across that seam because that's going to give you the greatest support, yes? Now, on the flip side is where you're going to attach the muslin. Again, the reason we use muslin is because it's lightweight, it's durable, it's dependable. The nice thing about the muslin is that if you have an 8-foot wide flat, for instance, you need 48-inch wide muslin. Or you can also, but you can get muslin up at 7, 8, 10 feet wide if you need it. So depending on how wide your flat is, you can find muslin that'll fit it, and it is always going to be the cheapest material that's out there to cover things with. You always want to, as you are putting on sawhorses, put your flat on sawhorses, the frame, lay your muslin out, take a stapler, hand stapler, and go along the inside edge of the frame and attach the muslin to the frame temporarily. You don't want to pound the staples in because usually you're going to take the staples out, but you just temporarily attach the staple through the muslin all the way around. You want to leave, you need a little sag. Usually the depth of the frame is 3/4 of an inch. Usually that little sag is enough. If you've got a very large expanse, sometimes you need a larger sag. And the reason for that is because the muslin is what's going to call size. It's the reason your jeans shrink in the laundry. Cotton, as it gets heated and wet and dries, will shrink. Yes? And so what you want to do is staple that muslin on, and then you want to flip the edge back. The reason you use staple on the inside edge of the frame is because you're going to flip that muslin over, and you're going to take glue, white glue, and you're going to glue the edges all the way around the frame. You don't necessarily have to glue on toggles or diagonal braces, but I would definitely glue all the way around the outside frame and then flip it down and press it tight. And I would even glue over the top so you have a nice firm seal on your muslin. And then once that glue is dry, you can then pull the staples, and then using either a water glue mixture or starch water mixture, or just sometimes the paint that is the base coat will do enough sizing for it. You might want to have to do a test just in case. Starch always works. Sometimes the paint will work, sometimes it's not enough and it'll sag again. But you want to go ahead and size the flat, and it becomes nice and tight like a drum, yes? And then what you can do is put your base coat on and your other layers of paint and that sort of thing. But that's how you go about making a Broadway flat, yes? Now, a Hollywood flat is the same basic construction techniques, rails, stiles, toggles, no diagonal braces, except that as opposed to the wood being flat, you turn it on edge. So in a Broadway flat, you have your rail, you have your stile, they're this way. In a Hollywood flat, you turn them on edge like this, which gives the flat a depth, depending upon how deep the wood is. If you have a 1x4, you now have 3.5 inches of depth to it. And especially if you're doing flats that are doors or windows where you would have a natural relief, a natural depth in the piece, Hollywood flats are much nicer because then you can create the flat and then attach the door and or the windows separately, the frame and everything, the window frame, window door, and then just attach it to the back, and you can just create the hole as you create the flat, yes? Now, the other thing about Hollywood flats is because they're covered with luan, with wood, as opposed to being covered with muslin, you don't have to size them. They are already sized. And because you have that lumber that's holding the flat together on the outside, and the lumber you hope is square. If you bought a piece of non-square lumber from Lowe's, you need to take it back and let them know. But you can use that piece of luan to actually frame and square the flat on the outside of the flat as well. And again, you can use your router. We talked about routing, we talked about woodworking. The nice thing is if you have any overhang, or if you have a door or window you're going to cut out, you can just route it out with the window, where the window is or where the door is. So it aids, it's speedy. The other nice thing is if you are creating a stock unit, again, you can take the door or the window off as opposed to a Broadway flat where the door or the window pretty much stay with the unit. And that way you can flip different doors and different windows into the same flat and then repaint it. Or again, as opposed to Broadway flats where you pretty much have to paint the pattern. If you had a wallpaper pattern, you had to paint it pretty much. On Hollywood flats, you can actually wallpaper, or just use regular wallpaper if that's the best answer, best solution, yes. Again, on the back of the flat, you want to have two basic types of ways of having the flat stand erect. the best way, obviously, is to have a wall that has a joint in it, because the wall will hold the flat up and also hold it erect. But on the back side, you often have either a jack brace or a stage brace. A jack brace is a permanently constructed angle that is 90 degrees that attaches either by using a loose pin hinge or tie pin hinge, or by screwing it to the flat edge. A stage brace is an adjustable brace that usually will need a stage screw on one end and a hook on the flat on the other end. Again, depending upon how the scenery might have to shift, the stage brace might be a better option, or the jack brace might be a better option. Jack braces are a little bit more cumbersome to travel with if you're moving the scenery. Stage braces are really easy to break down. There's a little thumb screw in the middle of them, so you can expand or retract. You just undo the screw, loosen it from the hook on one side, take your stage screw out the other, and now you just have a long board, or long two boards that are held together, and the flat is free moving. Yes. And a jack brace, you really, again, the easiest way to do it really is to hinge it and then just fold it into the frame of the flat and then carry them both off. Jack braces are really cumbersome when it comes to carrying them separately, as opposed to a stage brace, which is something you can easily do that with. Yes. So those are ways of creating a wall that stands erect. Yes. Now, as far as doors and windows are concerned, I would say the single hardest thing to construct well on a set is a window that operates the way a window is supposed to operate. And the reason for that is many. One, it's got to be square. Two, windows often go up and down, and whereas in a home you have things like jambs that you can put in or that sort of thing, in the theater, counterweighting a window is a precise art. And especially if it's not an installation, if it's something that travels, or if it's some sort of wagon, the weight can be thrown off, or the angle of it, or the squareness of it, or the right side upside could be a little different. And anything that can cause a window to jam will cause it to jam. And so windows just are, as opposed to a window sliding up or sliding down, if you can have a window that opens like a door, hinges, that is always the best way to go. Especially if somebody's gonna have to climb through the window. If you think about it this way, if you have a normal window where you have two panes in front of each other, usually the back pane lifts up and goes down, and you have to fit yourself through that little bitty space to get in and out of it. If you have a door, if a window is paneled and opens this way with hinges, yes, then you have the entire height of the window that you can get through. Yes, and then you can close it very easily and latch it very easily. Yes, so given the choice between a classic standard window that goes raises and lowers, and a window that is not necessarily classic but still is viable, if you can encourage your designers to use the hinge kind of window, that's usually the best type. If your windows don't have to open, great. Again, I would use acrylic or plexiglass as opposed to glass, always. Glass on stage, I'll say it, maybe every video I make, glass on stage is just a bad idea. So if you happen to buy a glass window, break out the glass and put in a piece of plexi if you've got to. Now, a couple of the main points, again, the top and the bottom of the window are called rails, just like a flat. The sides are called stiles, just like in a flat. The internal pieces of the windows are called muntins, yes? And often they are very thin and very delicate, yes? The casing is the facing flat or facing lumber that is the molding to the window. So the window casing runs this way. The bottom of the window, there's a window sill. It is often called, the front edge of the sill is called the stool, and below the stool is what's called the apron. All of those could be decorative depending on the period, the style, all that sort of stuff, but that's the basic parts of a window, yes? Doors are much the same. You have a door, you have the top and the bottom of the door are called rails. Surprise, surprise. The sides of the windows are called stiles. any kind of internal bracing on a door, just like on a flat, it's called a toggle. And then a door is usually named after how many different panels it has. Now, a panel is a sort of a rectangle or a square. So for instance, a standard 6-panel door is going to have 2 smaller panels at the top and then 4 elongated panels. Again, standard heights, a doorknob is 3 foot off the ground. If you've ever gotten home in the middle of the night and reached for a doorknob and you just know where they are, your body knows where it is. It's 3 foot off the ground. That's how high 3 feet is. Your body just knows that, because again, in the dark, if you have a handle that's been hung incorrectly or upside down, God forbid, it's gonna be in the wrong place. Yes, and especially in older homes, and by that I mean 17th, 18th century homes, there wasn't a standard, but U.S. standard is for a door handle to be 3 feet off the ground. Now, a door can hinge one of 4 ways. Yes. A door can hinge on the right side or the left side. That's 1, 2. And then it can open in or it can open out in each case. So you have right in, right out, left in, left out. The way you tell, when you go to the store, they're gonna ask you what hand your door is. What hand your door is. The way you tell is you put your butt to the butt of the hinge and you reach for the doorknob. If your butt is to the butt of the hinge and you reach this way, that is a right-handed door. If your butt is to the butt of the door hinge and you reach this way, that is a left-handed door, okay? So they're gonna ask you that because they have, they're just cut differently. It's prepared for the door handle because the door handle wants to shut and go a certain way. If it goes the wrong way, then you push the door open. I mean, for instance, all front doors, yes, you listen to me, all front doors open in. Why? Because if it opened out, the butt of the hinge would be outside, and in order to break into your house, all the burglar would have to do would be to take the pin out of the hinge, which is not that difficult to do. Yes? The hinge by its very nature has got to have a loose pin in it in order to work. And even though there have been lots of companies that put lots of time into welding things and making things pin hinges hard to get out, a good burglar can break those welds very quickly, and your home is no longer secure and safe, no matter how good the your alarm system is, and or how many deadbolts you got. So the front door to the house always opens in. Now it can still be right-handed or left-handed. Yes, it can still you can still hinge it from the right side or the left side, but it always opens in. Yes, bathroom doors tend to open in for the same reason. Room doors tend to open in for the same reason. Yes. So again, just a little bit about doors and windows you're going to come across. Cool. Now, other types of flats you're going to find. A lot of the times you'll build what are called profile flats. Flats that have different, like for instance, buildings on them or scenery on them, that sort of thing. Trees, like it's a forest in the background. Oftentimes they'll be in what are called ground rows, which is the upstage piece. Yes. Usually, ground rows are meant to cover lighting instruments that are hidden behind them. Now, lighting instruments have gotten a lot more advanced lately. A standard light system years ago, the ground row had to be at least 2 foot tall to hide all the instrumentation. Nowadays, because of the LED technology and that sort of thing, lights literally are less than 6 inches tall, so your ground row doesn't have to be very tall at all. But a lot of times maybe spent on cutting out patterns in flats. Again, those have to be Luan, so they have to be Hollywood by their nature. Now you could have a top of that that's Hollywood that attaches to a Broadway flat below. I would say that would be rare. Usually if you're going to go with one style, you stick to that style for the whole construction. Yes, it probably, as a matter of fact, it would weaken it if you did anything other than one standard. But if you have a stock piece that's Broadway, that gets you up 2 feet, and then all you have to do is attach some little detailed stuff on top, that saves you money, saves you time, then that may be the way to go. Yes. Curved flats. there is this wonderful material called wiggle wood, where they, instead of having cross grain, instead of having a piece of plywood where the grain goes this way on one sheet and this way on the next veneer and this way on the next veneer and this way on the next veneer, which is the standard construction, wiggle wood would have all the grains going the same way, which makes it very easy to bend. You can make a very tight circle out of it. And so you just take, in order to create the curves, you're gonna have to build the ribs out of 3/4 inch plywood, because you're gonna have to cut a curve in it. So here's a little picture of this person building a curved flat, and you can see that they're using C-clamps and also a little block in order to keep the indentation of the C-clamp off of the piece. Now, one of the problems with building on a curve, as you can see, is that it's hard to necessarily line up or guess where the edge of the piece is going to be. So oftentimes you're going to place the rib, or where the flat on the one end attaches, as you're building it. So it's, again, because it's a curve and because your stock may vary, I would suggest creating the rib as you go. Yes. But again, I would say it's nearly impossible. I'm sure somebody's been figuring out a way to do it, but it is very difficult to build a Broadway curved flat. But that's almost by definition going to have to be a Hollywood flat if it's a curved flat at all. Cool. Now let's talk about a couple ways. We've already mentioned a couple ways, but let's talk about a couple ways of joining flats together. One is a very common technique used in theater, to use a loose pin hinge. A loose pin hinge, as it might describe to you, is a hinge that has a pin that very easily pulls out. Again, the loose pin hinge usually comes with a pin. The problem is that it doesn't, well, there's oftentimes you will use a 12 penny nail as opposed to that pin that comes with it, because the nice thing about a 12 penny nail is, because the nail has a nice sharp point, so it makes it easier to go ahead and flip through, especially if there's any kind of tension between the two hinges as they come together. And it also has that nice head of the nail. If you bend the head of the nail, it makes it easy to grip. So again, oftentimes you replace the pin that comes with the loose pin hinge with a 12 penny nail, but beyond that, loose pin hinge is an excellent way of putting things together. If you have a tight pin hinge and you have a booked flat is where the two sides of the flat, two flats, are hinged in the front and they come together. Oftentimes you'll have a seam and you will see through the crack in the flats. And in order to avoid that, you add this material called Dutchman. Oftentimes, to be honest with you, I just use duct tape or gaff tape. But true Dutchman is a piece of muslin that you pull all the selvage off, so you have a nice flared edge. You put it in glue, and then you just place it through and on the internal seam. And the great thing about that, you can paint it just like you do the rest of the flat. It blends in because of the nice feathering, and then it hides the hinges as well as covers the opening seam between the two booked flats. But again, the nice thing about a booked flat is, because the two pieces are holding themselves square and up, you don't need to add any kind of things like jack braces or stage braces. Yes, so that's an awful nice thing. Another way to do this is use what are called coffin locks. Coffin lock, as it might suggest, is something that they developed to put on coffins. There's two parts to a coffin lock. There's one part that has a receptacle, the male side and the female side. The female side has a little ratchet that sort of decreases as it spins, so it'll grab it and then pull it tight, the female side. You often will need a little T-handle that goes into that piece to tighten and untighten. When you install a coffin lock, you can put it in upside down. So even though I'm going to tell you to always use righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, in other words, when you turn something to the right, it gets tight. When you turn it to the left, it gets loose. In the case of a coffin lock, because you can put it in upside down, it may be the other way around. So you can tell if it's put in right if, when you put it together and tighten it, it turns to the right. That is put in correctly. If you put it incorrectly, then you'll be lefty, tighty, righty. I don't know what I'm trying to say. No, just don't do it wrong. Another real quick way is to use hook and eyes. The old way you held your screen door shut. If you just need two pieces, again, if the pieces are holding each other up because they are booked or somehow connected. Sometimes a hook and eye is just the quickest, easiest way to hold two flats up together. Yes. Now you can also lash the flats together. I would suggest this especially on very tall pieces. I'm talking about 16 feet or taller that have to be put together and then quickly taken apart. And the way you have a lash eye, in other words, just an eye screw that is at the top that you've tied a string to, and you have a lash cleat, which is basically just a piece of metal that sticks out, and you just take the rope around the cleat and around the cleat and around the cleat, and when you pull, it cinches it together, and then you tie it off at the bottom. And usually there's a stop cleat at the bottom to tie off to, yes? And then when you want to get rid of them, you untie that knot, and the two flats become separated very quickly, yes? So again, just using a lash line is a great way of doing that, and you don't have to worry about hinge pins or anything like that. The problem with loose pin hinges, of course, you're only 6 foot tall or less, so you can only reach so high. So again, if you have a 10 foot, 12 foot, 14 foot flat, the lash line becomes an even better idea about ways of keeping flats together, especially if that be, obviously if pieces don't have to come apart during a show, just screw them together, connect them. These connecting ways are only for shifts in scenery that involve the flats coming apart. Cool. Again, here's a little quick reminder of what the difference between a jack brace is and a stage brace. You can see the stage brace has got a little thumb screw there in the middle and a brace cleat at the top and a straight stage screw at the bottom. Usually there is the other problem is with stage braces is that if your director is somebody or the set needs to move, once you've installed a stage screw receptacle, you have put a hole in the floor. Now, if the theater won't allow you to put a hole in the floor, you can't use a stage screw, yes? And so you're gonna have to use the jack brace, yes? Now, the reason for the drawing though is because of stiffeners. The basic stiffener is what's called a batten. It is created by building what are called hog troughs. You take one piece of 1x4 this way, one piece of 1x4 this way. You created, in farming terms, a hog trough, but in stiffener terms, you created a very stiff board, and all that does is it lips over the top, and it loose pin hinges on, and it keeps the flat totally square and flat to itself, yes? Very easy to take off. Again, if you have one in the middle, it could just be called a stiffener, as opposed to the batten would be at the top. Cool. On the on-stage side, there are several typical types of molding that, depending on the period that you're in, will be at various heights, okay? I know that may not make a lot of sense right now, but it will be hopefully by the next 5 minutes here. First of all, the baseboard is pretty standard as far as periods doesn't matter. The depth of the baseboard though will change. In other words, for instance, right now, I don't know if you can see it, but we have a little vinyl piece of plastic that's running around this room as baseboard. Molding oftentimes is used to cover imperfections in construction. And so most oftentimes the molding will be around the window, around the casing, around the door, around the casing. That way, in case you have things that are not exactly square or plumb, yes, you can hide that with the molding or the casing, yes. Baseboards cover that transition from the floor to the ceiling, floor to the wall. Cornices, yes, cover the transition from the wall to the ceiling. So cornices at the top. There are several different types of both, but again, depending upon the period of time, some baseboards are 1.5 feet thick because construction techniques weren't that good. Floors weren't that level, walls weren't that level back in the day. Nowadays, it's just a strip of vinyl because it's pretty much just hiding nothing, just keeping the carpet from coming up, yes? Cornice at the top, baseboard at the bottom. The chair rail is a piece of molding that will change in height. Nowadays, it's usually around 3 foot tall, and that's because most chairs nowadays are around 3 foot tall, the back of them. So when the chair backs into the wall, instead of leaving a dent, it hits the wood molding that is the chair rail. And through time, depending on how tall the standard chair was for the period, it might raise to 4 or 5 feet tall. So the chair rail can change depending on time period. And again, it's one of those things where it's subtle, but if you have a 4 foot tall chair and a chair rail at 3 feet, it just looks wrong. Yes, so if you're gonna have a whole lot of period chairs at 4 feet, the chair rail needs to be there because that's where the chair is going to bump into the wall. So the chair rail is there to keep the back of the chair from denting the molding. Okay, now this is 25 cents worth of knowledge. Technically, from the chair rail down is called the wainscoting. From the chair rail up is called the dado. Yes? Now, oftentimes if you go to the lumber store and talk about wainscoting, they'll think it's the other way around, or dados. They don't even know what that is. They think it's a dead bird. But that's technically what those are called, wainscoting, dado. Yes? Now, the other typical types of molding on a wall is, one is called a plate rail and one is called a picture rail. A plate rail is usually somewhere between the chair rail and the top of the door. And again, back in the day, they used to put plates on the wall for display because the fine china was very expensive and people were very proud of it. So instead of putting it away in a cabinet somewhere, they would hang the plate on the wall, and a plate rail, it has a little ledge on it, a little lip on it, so that when you put it there, just like this little tab here, put the plate there, and that holds the plate onto the wall. A picture rail is typically anywhere above the door frame, below the cornice, and again, the reason it's there is so you can put a little nail in the plate rail, the picture rail, and then hang your painting, or your picture, or your portrait, or whatever it is, from the picture rail. Yes, and so usually, again, today we have a wire, but behind we don't even see the wires. We hide the wires. But in the day, you used to see the paintings hanging from this picture rail. And again, the reason for the picture rail and the plate rail and the chair rail is because walls were made out of plaster, and if you bumped or hit the plaster wall, it disintegrated over time. Yes, it crumbled. Yes, and so again, one of the reasons for wallpaper is because initially wallpaper was covering the wall, but it also, when the plaster chipped, it would collect behind the wallpaper. One of the problems with plaster walls, I'm going to try and get too graphic here, but plaster is made of a substance that mice find very appetizing. So one of the reasons that homes during this time period started having lots of nice little rats around is because they like eating the walls. So, just fun information to know. Again, here's a little chart showing you hundreds of different types of molding. You got your molding for your casing, for your windows, for your doors. You got cove molding for your cornice up top, pretty standard. Dental molding is something that's very decorative, that's called dental because it looks like teeth. Chair rail is standard, looks a little thickness of it. Baseboard, picture rails, all those little pieces are just standard types of molding that'll be sold in most hardware stores that you can, again, order online as well. Cool. There's a little chart for you to keep. Now, a couple other things. The pediments or the headers for doors and windows. Oftentimes doors and windows have little decorative pieces over the top of them. There are standard pediments. Again, some are scroll tops, are pretty standard, and especially in America. They go along with the style. You'll find triangular pieces, you'll find oval pieces, you'll find square pieces over the top. Again, different types of, instead of just having a cup there, you might have a statuary. If you, for instance, if you go to Liberty Hall, there's a little statue of a woman holding Little Liberty, holding it up there. So a lot of times you'll have little statuary involved in the molding over the door, that sort of thing. A lot of times you'll have windows above the door or window. If a window, you have a casing above it. Yes. Another thing that helps define period and style a lot are the arches. Again, the Romans were the first civilization to discover that if you took a circular piece and had a very strong keystone at the top of it, you could create an arch. The keystone, just like the piece of the piece of joinery we were talking about earlier, is flanged in the sense that it's wider at the top than it is at the bottom, so they can hold the bricks and keep them from falling. Now, the thing about an arch, once you have created an arch or figured out how to keep an arch from falling down, all you do is create a series of arches and you have created a dome, which is what they did in Florence for the first dome in the 13th century, 14th century, yes? Which is a series of arches turned side and side and side. Again, the standard pieces of the arch, you've got the keystone at the very top. You have the rise of the arch is from the what's called the spring line. The spring line is where it goes from square to circular, easiest way to put that. So the rise of an arch, again, should be consistent. It's the radius, it should be a radius. Again, you'll see, like in some things, some styles, the oriental pieces, that sort of thing, you'll have some points and that sort of things. And the round trefoil, you'll have a couple of little indentations there. Anyway, the haunch is the measurement of the outside of the circular, of the radius. And again, that depends on how thick the actual bricks are that you're laying. The crown is, of course, the height of the arch, and the intrados is the interior circumference, let's put it that way. Yes? So those are the parts of the arch, but here again are a series of different types of arches. Some of them are going to look very period or stylistically. I mean, the round arch is certainly a Roman arch, but many of these look Oriental. Some of them look Asian. Some of them look Indian, because those styles were popularized in those very different parts of the world. Yes, for instance, in Russia, the ogre three-centered, excuse me, the OG, the OG arch. For some reason, Russians love the onion dome, the onion shape, and so a lot of their buildings have the onion top, and then they also have the OG three-centered arch. But again, that's a period research thing, and again, they're very different what techniques in building each of these, but all of them are dependent on a strong keystone to hold them together. Lastly, the roofs, different types of roofs. While the style of the roof may change with period, the pitch of the roof, the pitch is the angle of the roof, will also change. I mean, we're in a period of time right now, I don't know if you've noticed, that in home construction, we have a very high-pitched roofs nowadays. But if you've ever driven down the road and seen buildings that were built in the 70s, back when the Brady Bunch was popular, they have very low-pitched roofs. They're called ranch-style homes. But anytime you have two peaks coming together, that is called a gable. A house with 7 gables has 7 of those. Yes. Now, if you have if instead of the pieces coming together at a point, you have a third piece that is also angled, that's called a hip. And so those are the basic styles. Basically, you can have a gable or you can have a hip. If you have any kind of window unit sticking out, that's called a dormer. But the rest of them are pretty much understandable. The gazebo is probably the most intricate to build, simply because it employs 6 separate triangles all coming together at one point. And again, the triangle is the hardest thing to build perfectly, because if you change one side or miss on one side, you missed them all. Again, different roofing materials. Asphalt is the most common. Concrete tile is less common. Metal is probably, depending on storm damage and that sort of stuff, you might have a metal roof. In this area, wood shingles are not very popular, but if you go up to the north, they're very popular, because again, you have a lot of shavings that are just cheap. If you have, whenever you go to any kind of climate that is next to an ocean or a beach, the clay tiles are very popular. So again, depending on where you are, your style, even though your style of roof may change, but also the material it's made out of may change. Cool. So a little bit of information, a lot of information thrown at you about doors, windows, walls. But that's one of the basic types of construction that we deal with in the theater. Yes? All right, we'll see you next time. We'll talk about platforms and stairs. That'll be fun. See you then.